I'm Laura Trevelyan in Washington, and this is BBC World News America. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, has died at the age of 91. He presided over the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Welcome to World News America on PBS and around the globe. Russian news agencies are reporting tonight that Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, has died at the age of 91. He oversaw economic reforms known as Perestroika and political ones, glasnost or openness, which led to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the end of the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev and the US President Ronald Reagan agreed in 1985 that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, looks back at a historic life.
He was the kind of Russian leader the world had never seen. Mikhail Gorbachev smiled. He was relaxed. In the West, he acquired almost pop star status for helping to end the Cold War. But at home, it was a different story. Born in the days of dictator Joseph Stalin, Gorbachev became a committed communist, rising fast through the ranks of the Soviet Communist Party to the ruling Politburo. Gorbachev stood out. He was young, energetic, unlike his colleagues. As Kremlin old-timers died in quick succession, the USSR was looking more like a cemetery than a superpower. But in 1985, Gorbachev became leader and launched Perestroika, reforms to reinvigorate the Soviet Union. At home, there were Western-style walkabouts. Abroad, he charmed an iron lady and a US president. Together, Gorbachev and Reagan slashed their nuclear arsenals. With a reformer in the Kremlin, Eastern Europe saw a chance to break free from Moscow. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came crashing down. Crucially, Gorbachev refused to intervene to prop up the Iron Curtain.
Выработана была точка зрения такая вот так. Без крови. Не допустить, чтобы огромное дело, касающееся немцев, нас, всей Европы, всего мира.
It was Mikhail Gorbachev who became the terminator of the 20th century, who ended the Cold War, who ended domination of the Soviet Union over the Central and Eastern Europe. He dismantled this domination in the most willing and peaceful way. He let them go.
By now, his own country was breaking apart amid ethnic conflicts and economic chaos. Gorbachev was losing control. In August 1991, communist hardliners staged a coup. It collapsed, but soon after, so did the Soviet Union. President Gorbachev resigned, and the USSR was consigned to history. Many Russians still blame Gorbachev for letting a superpower slip away. Many of the changes Mikhail Gorbachev tried to make haven't lasted. Democratic freedoms are being rolled back in Russia. And the arms race is back, and geopolitical confrontation. Gorbachev will be remembered for at least having tried to end the rivalry between East and West. But I will remember him for this. After one interview, he invited me to play his piano while he sang the favourite songs of his late wife. It was a surreal but special moment that showed the warm, human side of the Russian leader who'd struck a chord with millions around the world.
And that's our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, reporting there on the passing of someone with whom he had a very personal connection. Well, for more on the passing of Mr. Gorbachev, I'm joined now by William Pomerantz, the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you for being with us. And how would you assess the historical significance of Gorbachev? Would the Iron Curtain have fallen without him and his reforms?
Mr. Gorbachev made a leap into the future for the Soviet Union and for the Russian Federation and for Eastern Europe. And he tried to do it to the best of his ability. Unfortunately, it was just not an easy transition to make, and Mr. Gorbachev struggled. But his reforms were lasting and consequential in terms of introducing democracy and introducing pluralism to an extent in the Soviet Union.
And what about his relationship with the US president of the time, Ronald Reagan? What did that mean for arms control and for the end of the Cold War?
It meant everything for the end of the Cold War. It was, again, Gorbachev who reached out to Ronald Reagan and to Margaret Thatcher and to other Western leaders and established a dialogue and not a confrontation. Again, prior to Mr. Gorbachev coming to power, the Soviet Union was a geriocracy. It was ruled by people who really couldn't deal with the problems of the Soviet Union. Mr. Gorbachev tried to deal with them. He tried to deal with them in the best way that he knew, taking into account the history that he had learned. But unfortunately for Mr. Gorbachev, the rest of the country and the rest of the party, quite frankly, was not willing to go along with him.
Do you know anything at all about Mikhail Gorbachev's attitude towards Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
He hasn't been very outspoken or talked about it, and it will be very interesting to see how Vladimir Putin remembers Mikhail Gorbachev. Obviously, in the present campaign against Ukraine, he is going against what Gorbachev tried to do, which was a peaceful transition from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation, a peaceful transition to Eastern Europe. And Vladimir Putin, with this invasion of Ukraine, has been outspoken about how Russia lost Ukraine, and he's trying to gain Russia back into the orbit of the Russian Federation. So it will be very interesting to see how Mr. Putin remembers Mr. Gorbachev and whether indeed there is some sort of marking of his passing in the Russian Federation.
Was Gorbachev concerned, though, about the eastward expansion of NATO, and didn't he accuse the West of arrogance?
He didn't really accuse the West of arrogance. There was a discussion about what was decided about the expansion of NATO. And according to Gorbachev, there was a promise that there would be no expansion to the east. Secretary of State Baker and other historians have refuted this, and it was not included in any sort of agreement at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse. So yes, there has been a controversy about the extent of whether the West promised Mikhail Gorbachev that there would be no expansion of NATO, but there was a long discussion, and there have been several books now written about this issue. And the general consensus, at least amongst Western historians, is that no promise was actually guaranteed at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
William Pomerantz, thank you so much for joining us. Well, for more, let's bring in our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg. And Steve, how is Mikhail Gorbachev being remembered in Russia?
Very differently from how he'll be remembered outside of the country. Here, many Russians see him as a weak leader. They blame him for the collapse of their superpower, the collapse of their country. What followed the collapse of the USSR after 1991 was a very difficult decade. In the 1990s, millions of Russians fell into poverty. And ever since then, with the support, I have to say, of Vladimir Putin's government, Gorbachev has been blamed as the man who lost control of reforms and couldn't prevent the collapse of his country. Now, outside of Russia, it's a very different story. And it's amazing to think today, when we see such tension between East and West, that there was a time not so long ago when there was a man.
And I'm sorry, we seem to have lost our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, there. Of course, as soon as we do get him back, we'll return to our lead story this evening, the death of the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He has died at the age of 91. Russian news agencies are reporting this evening, and we can return to Steve Rosenberg, who's our Russia editor. And Steve, you were just talking there about how Russia remembers Mikhail Gorbachev and how different it is to the way he's seen from the outside of the country.
Yes, many Russians criticized him, but outside of Russia, he was lauded. He was lauded as the man who helped to end the Cold War, the man who tried his best to make the world a safer place. You know, he didn't set out to destroy communism. He didn't set out to destroy the Soviet Union. This happened. And that's simply because many people believe that the Soviet Union wasn't reformable. You know, he tried to change things. He realized that in the mid-1980s, the USSR needed change. The Soviet economy was in big trouble. Something had to be done. He tried to do something, but the country fell apart. And I think it's important to mention that, you know, he was a very warm, personable person. This was a man who loved dearly his wife. This was a man with a sense of humor. Huge contrast to some of the political figures in power in Russia today. And can you blame Gorbachev for getting it wrong with reforms? I don't think you can. You know, it's a big question about whether the USSR, whether this huge communist superpower could have actually been reformed and kept together. As it was, it fell apart. And many Russians, more than 3 decades on, still blame him for that.
And Steve, what about Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine? In so many ways, Putin is the exact opposite of Gorbachev. Do you have any clues about what Gorbachev thought at the end of his life about that move by Putin?
Well, in recent months, Mikhail Gorbachev had kept pretty quiet about things. In fact, he'd spent a long time in hospital. I think he'd spent the last couple of years, actually, living in hospital. He'd been in poor health. But yes, you're absolutely right. What we're seeing today from Vladimir Putin is the polar opposite from what we saw from Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev is someone who believed in peaceful coexistence with the West. He believed East and West could join hands and walk off into a better future together. What we're seeing today from the current Russian leader is confrontation, conflict. Basically, Russia is in conflict with the West. And Gorbachev's legacy, as the man who ended the Cold War, has been pretty much torn to pieces, you have to say, by the current government in Moscow.
Steve Rosenberg in Moscow tonight on the death of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. He's died at the age of 91.